In Ukraine, there are two types of video games, those that are bright and energetic and act as a silly form of escape for a few hours. And then there's those that reflect a dark, alternate universe where grey, brown and dark green are the only colours visible to the eye. The most mainstream of these games is arguably the Metro series, based off the novels written by Dmitry Glukhovsky. Known for its dark atmosphere, scary frogmen and bullet money, the Metro series has garnered a passionate fanbase and sold millions of copies, but all of this success wouldn't have been possible without another post-apocalyptic game franchise, and one that was also based off a novel, and that's the STALKER franchise. STALKER is a series of games created by GSC Game World, known in the early to mid 2000s for pumping out countless strategy games. Seriously, look at their list of games in the span of 5 years. Strategy game, 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 The most popular of these games was their Cossack series, but you can only develop so many strategy games before you start to go a bit mental, and this endless cycle clearly took a toll on GSC, because they went from one extreme to the other. Crafting a game with a world so depressing and foreboding, you'd think it's real life. Working on STALKER was such a big deal for many of the developers that some of them decided to bin it off and start their own development team, A4 Games, who decided to adapt the Metro novel series into video games. Okay, this timeline's a bit confusing, but I don't want to talk about Metro too much. I want to keep the focus on the soul-crushing, bread-eating, strange orb-collecting simulator that is STALKER: Shadow of Chernobyl. Set in the year 2012, I think, STALKER is set in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which is that place where all that bad shit happened. In this alternate universe, a second Chernobyl disaster occurred in 2006, causing the exclusion zone to expand and give way to all kinds of unnatural phenomena. Instead of giant catfish knocking about, there's countless mercenaries, criminals, freaky mutants, and an abundance of stalkers. What exactly is a stalker, besides from that guy that follows you home from the bus stop at night? It's hard to say exactly, because the game doesn't give you much information to go off of, which is a running theme for STALKER. What is stated is that we play as one of these stalkers, a man suffering from amnesia, who is simply referred to as the Marked One, due to his stalker tattoo. Good thing he's got his job occupation tattooed on him. Would be a bit embarrassing if he was a janitor though. Remembering nothing from his past, besides a few flashes and the name of someone he needs to kill, he sets out on a journey to find his lost memories and find out how he ended up in the zone in the first place. STALKER is a very trippy experience. Throughout the game, you'll catch yourself saying, "What?" more times than you can count. Does this make the game bad or incoherent? No. Well, at least not for the most part. For a game that came out in 2007, STALKER is a very ambitious game that you could argue helped pave the way for later tactical survival shooters to take inspiration from. And for such a small indie team to pull this off at the time, you have to give GSC credit. Now the game is far from perfect, which I'll get into, but since STALKER 2 is right around the corner, I wanted to celebrate this game for its everlasting effect on post-apocalyptic shooters and survival shooters too, and to hopefully hit the YouTube algorithm. The game begins with a truck driving through a rainstorm. Where the truck's going isn't made clear, but what is made clear is that the truck is full of dead and nearly dead bodies. Poor bastards. Surely it can't get any worse for them. A random stalker helps out a lone survivor, who turns out to be the Marked One. He gets this label from this other guy who's absolutely destroying this chicken leg. This fella is called Sidrovich, a stalker trader who gets you up and running in the zone. Turns out a stalker is someone who goes into the zone to find artifacts. Artifacts as in clay pots or a stone with a face carved in it? No. The artifacts that stalkers look for are weird objects with unique abilities, and they're scattered throughout the zone. It's a little neat mechanic that I'll bring up again later, after I've dealt with the introduction. Sidrovich initially acts as the quest giver for the Marked One, introducing you to many of the game's core mechanics. It would be nice to say he did this out of the kindness of his heart, but like a fat, greasier version of Tom Nook, he basically puts you to work for saving your life.
What are you standing there for?
Basically, he gives you a tablet that is very overpowered and is your crutch in this unforgiving place. Your iPad keeps you up to date on your current objectives, has a built-in map that shows you where you are, and allows the Marked One to receive intel on the go. These are the basics of what you can do with the tablet, but they are far from the only features available for Mr. Stalker to use. Like a tablet or phone owned by someone over the age of 40, there's countless windows open at your disposal, one showing your contacts, one showing you information regarding the zone which helps build up the lore of the game, and the one that piqued my interest the most when I first saw it, which is the Stalker ranking system. Every Stalker in the game is put on a leaderboard showing you how good they are at their job, which boils down to finding glowing rocks and shooting the piss out of thieves and mutated dogs. The Marked One starts at the bottom of the leaderboard, and this I felt was a cool addition to the game as it pushes you to actually play and beat Stalker to reach the sweet top spot. The tablet comes with its very own enemy detector. The zone is swarming with different factions and people who want you dead, and your tablet helps you detect other humans nearby. The number of nearby enemies will be displayed with this number, and the regular and friendly people are displayed with either yellow or green icons. Finding your objective is pretty simple, as you've got an arrow telling you where to go. I guess the guide arrow from Dead Rising has a little brother. The main gameplay loop of Stalker is scavenging supplies, shooting bad guys, scavenging their supplies, finding artifacts, shooting mutants, scavenging supplies, and so on. All of this is easier said than done. Though the game can be very rewarding, it can also be incredibly brutal with how much it throws at you. The early game is a baptism of fire as you figure out how certain enemies behave, how many enemy varieties there are, what weapons are available, and how often you should save, because this game is a ball ache when you die and haven't saved fairly recently. Yep, it sends you straight back to the beginning of the level, which, if you spent time exploring, can lead to over an hour of game time getting pissed away. But you shouldn't worry about that. You're a stalker after all, not the creepy kind, the badass kind, so you should be well equipped. While since you're at the bottom of the food chain in this radiated ecosystem, you need to use whatever you can get your hands on. The early game is all about taking your time picking off enemies, then quickly looting them for all they're worth. The most obvious things to grab are their guns. You can't kill a mutant with a hug after all, but you'll need other things to survive the zone too. Medical supplies can be found that keep you going, such as bandages that give you a small amount of health, and the much more effective medkits that come in a variety of flavours.
Oh, you mean blueberry and banana.
Since the whole area is radiated to fuck, you need stims to keep your radiation levels down, and if you've not got any of them handy, just neck a bottle of vodka. Stalkers can't work on empty stomachs, so keeping a healthy supply of food is a must to keep you on your toes. Those artifacts I mentioned earlier are very helpful at keeping you alive, well, most of them are. These strange objects were created from random materials when the second disaster happened, infusing within them magic or healing properties or some shit. These artifacts are scattered throughout the zone and give the player different buffs and debuffs. The zone doesn't sound so bad. Sure, there's bad guys about and a little bit of radiation, but that never hurt nobody. But I forgot to mention that the second incident also created some pretty strange weather conditions called anomalies. These are essentially condensed natural disasters that can deal tons of damage in a small area. When you first see them, you're almost entranced by them, like a fly to one of those blue lights. But once you get too close, wave goodbye to that health bar of yours. Some of them are pretty easy to spot, like these pools of electricity, but some can catch you completely off guard and perk you up when things are too quiet. These elements make Stalker stick out when compared to other 2000s shooters, and it makes you pause and think, wow, this game is really weird. It's hard to pigeonhole Stalker because it has so many quirks and gimmicks that belong to a number of different video game genres. The game has flashes of a survival horror, tactical shooter, and most surprisingly, an RPG. Despite the fantastical elements of magical orbs and living fireballs, Stalker feels at least a little bit grounded, and that's mostly down to the tactical side of the combat. Despite being the main character, you die just as quickly as most of the other faceless Stalkers in the game. This means you can't be the gung-ho hero you always dreamt of being, and instead have to think carefully about where you're moving and where you're aiming. There's very little room for error when in gunfights, as one wrong move or unchecked corner could send you back to the beginning of the level. Sound also plays a part in the combat. Making too much noise will give away your position, alerting nearby enemies to your location. Running directly at an enemy will make a shit ton of noise, so the marked one is able to crouch to reduce noise. He can then reduce even more noise by crouching just a tiny bit more. Partner this with the ability to peek around corners, and you'll complete your transformation into a Rainbow Six degenerate. It adds a lot of tension when you're skulking around and waiting for an enemy to pop out. There are several guns available to use, ranging from assault rifles, shotguns, submachine guns, snipers, grenade launchers, railguns, and dogshit pistols that do absolutely nothing. This vast array of weapons encourages you to try different things. Just be careful on how cocky you get, because at any moment, your gun could jam. Weapons and equipment have varying conditions. While the condition of equipment wears out when you get shot, your weapon condition lowers the more you use it, and the lower it is, the more often it jams. This adds another factor to think about when attacking enemies, as it can completely flip the tide of a gunfight. Fighting guys with guns can be very stressful on its own, as the AI is pretty smart. Enemies tend to creep up on you and have the same moveset the player has. I think one of their most devastating moves has to be the ability to shoot you through walls. That was such a cool and unique feature for the devs to add in. Definitely doesn't make your blood boil every single time it happens. Calling Stalker a survival horror seems a step too far. It's more of a survival game with horror elements sprinkled in there for good measure. I'd argue the horror comes from the fear of failing and having to start the mission all over again, but that's not to say the game doesn't have some genuinely scary moments. Soldier jump scares aside, the zone is full of mutants that aren't interested in finding colourful rocks, but rather only exist to make your time in the zone a stress-inducing one. The wildlife within the zone has become hostile. Dogs travel in packs and tend to attack anything that moves. Other forms of wildlife wildlife seem to have been completely transformed beyond recognition. Not quite sure what this thing is, but it's getting a bullet to the head. Though the wildlife is unsettling to look at for the most part, they're easy to deal with. Just a couple of bullets can send them packing to animal heaven. It's the humanoid mutants that really get under your skin. Snorks are the most recognisable and famous mutants from the S.T.A.L.K.E.R universe. Probably one of the more animalistic of the humanoid mutants, these freaks charge at you on all fours and leap through the air to close the distance. Apparently these things are ex-soldiers, which is probably why they try to use takedowns on you. S.T.A.L.K.E.R also has zombies. Not your typical Walking Dead type of zombies, but they are just as brain dead, since their minds have been fried from psi emissions. Despite being pretty much brain dead, they can still speak a little, and are still capable of using their firearms. They're pretty much the exact same as normal human enemies, but they just stagger around and mumble, like your dad stumbling home from the pub. These guys are far from the scariest enemies, unlike the bloodsuckers. These things are incredibly rare. Throughout my entire playthrough of the game, I ran into 4, maybe 5 of them, and each time was just as unsettling as the last. Whereas most of the humanoid mutants at least look a little bit human, bloodsuckers look like aliens. Yeah, cheers. I didn't want to sleep tonight anyway. Scary monsters would feel out of place if the world they resided in didn't feel right, and the zone feels like a truly horrible place. The fact that most of the people in the game came here willingly is beyond me. Are you alright in the head, mate? Lost your marbles, maybe? The atmosphere in this game is so depressing, but in a good way. It doesn't matter where you go, the countryside, a base, or in the ruins of old buildings, everything feels wrong. It feels like one big liminal space. It's even more disturbing when you realise that many of the places in the game are actually real places. GSC wanted the game to feel grounded, despite having all of these fantastical elements, and it almost blurs the line between reality and fiction, like you're walking through a bad dream. There's many elements to the game that feel fantastical. From the bizarre science of it all to the strange ghost people, it makes you want to peel away the layers of the world, which the game lets you do without revealing too much. An element of S.T.A.L.K.E.R that really caught me off guard was that it has RPG elements. The reputation system plays heavily into how you interact with other inhabitants of the zone. There's several factions within the zone who all have their own goals and beliefs, and since the Marked One is a social butterfly, he can float between the groups and complete side quests for them and build up his reputation with other stalkers. Keeping a strong reputation gives you more opportunities for side quests and keeps the number of hostile NPCs down, though of course if you want to watch the world burn, you can just shoot the piss out of anyone who looks at you funny. You can also trade with other stalkers and have conversations with them, revealing more about the zone and the state of the world as a whole. This works so well because neither you or the Marked One really know what's going on, so it adds a little bit more context to the story.
Нет, убери ствол, тогда поговорим.
No idea what you're talking about, mate, but it's got me hooked. When I was playing through the story, I had a little bit of trouble keeping up with what was going on. Often you'll just run from one place to another with little to no context on why you're going to these places. It can feel a bit disjointed, but apparently according to the wiki, it has a non-linear story. The player can make certain choices throughout the game that determine where the story goes, and since I didn't follow the story correctly, like an idiot, I ended up missing a large part of the story. I was never able to find S.T.A.L.K.E.R and instead went on a mission to find the Wish Granter, a legend among stalkers that, like the name suggests, grants whoever reaches it a wish of their choice. After helping destroy several underground facilities, the Marked One made one last journey to yet another underground facility, where the Wish Granter is rumoured to be, but not before getting shot to death about 80 times by armed guards and helicopters. After reaching the bunker, there it was, the Wish Granter. It turned out to be real, and in my playthrough, the Marked One asks for the zone to end.
I want the zone to disappear.
I thought that was quite a nice ending. No more freaky mutants and gangs of coked up gunslingers. It all seemed calm until I realised that the Marked One had been turned blind by the Wish Granter. Alright, guess the game's over then. This conclusion didn't sit well with me, and so I decided to look up more about the game. Turns out there's 7 endings in total. Most of them are fake endings and are determined by your reputation, money, and whether or not you gun down a couple of faction leaders. I ended up getting one of these false endings. The true endings are achieved by essentially not skimping out on quests like a lazy twat. The rest of the story reveals that the Marked One is actually S.T.A.L.K.E.R.
Still alive. Look, Straylock, we've got no time, so I need you to listen to me.
That's quite a twist, and it also turns out that the Wish Granter is a load of shite. It basically turns you into a slave. I'll be honest, this story is really confusing. Just trying to read and understand what's happening in this game is making my brain melt. I'll try to put the rest of it into simple terms. Basically, Greenfella is a bad guy. Well, bad guys. Greenfella wants to brainwash the world to get rid of negative thoughts, and depending on your choices, S.T.A.L.K.E.R can either say nuh-uh or yuh-huh. I feel like the nuh-uh ending fits the best, as it gives a bit of closure for S.T.A.L.K.E.R, and that grass looks very comfy. While I will say that Shadow of Chernobyl is fun overall, has at the very least an intriguing story, if a little bit confusing at times, and an immersive atmosphere, the game has its fair share of problems that make the action of playing it feel like a chore. The mutant enemies aren't as numerous as I would have hoped. When booting up STALKER for the first time, seeing some of the promotional material and hearing where the game takes place, I was expecting to be greeted by a mutant-ridden wasteland, but it feels like a regular survival FPS most of the time. While you could argue that having the mutants be less common makes the times you actually encounter them more scary, if a game is set in a radiated wasteland, I want to fight freaky monsters. It sucks seeing how many mutants were cut from the game too. Sprinkling these guys throughout the game more often would have made STALKER more unpredictable. Instead, you're always in a firefight, going through the same gameplay loops. This wouldn't be so bad if the game was mechanically sound, but it's not. STALKER is meant to be difficult. It's meant to challenge you and make you think, come up with different ways to defeat enemies, scout out areas, crawl around, but often it just deteriorates into you getting shot at by 20 different people with practically no cover to protect you. This is extremely noticeable during the final few hours of the game. Once you reach a certain point in the story, you have to enter areas that are heavily radiated, and walking up to anything metallic causes your rads to go up. Doesn't sound so bad. Just stay away from metal shit, right? Yeah, well, you have to do this in wide open spaces most of the time, while getting shot at by dudes with pinpoint accuracy who for some reason seem to be immune to the effects of radiation. You can obtain gear that makes radiation less effective, but it in itself is not very effective. It's a good thing I had these magical pebbles. Fights are usually based less on how good you are at fighting and more on how many healing items you have and how lucky you are. Praying to God that your gun doesn't jam for the 80th time in a row and enemies don't shoot you through walls. Auto-saving in this game is pretty pointless because it only kicks in when you complete a mission, and missions can last up to an hour, so saving manually becomes a mechanic you have to remember to do, on top of already having to heal, take rad away, anti-rad drugs, eating stale bread to make sure you don't starve, and making sure bullets hit the target you're aiming at. I used the manual save almost like a diary describing my journey and overall mental state as the game went on. As you can see, the closer I got to the end, the more my brain started to melt down to a fine paste. All of my frustrations with the combat built up and hit me like a train in the final sequence of the game. Just as you're about to reach the Wish Granter, the entire military force of Ukraine and their mum and dads decide to come after you. On top of getting shot from every angle, getting radiated, having a countdown forcing you to move through the level quickly, and the camera shaking, a giant fucking helicopter is constantly up your arse. It feels like GSC believes they had to end the game on an incredibly exciting note, like a typical action game, but STALKER isn't a typical action game. Throughout most of STALKER, you are conditioned to take your time and move through each location carefully. Throwing all of that out of the window for the last couple of hours of the game could have been a great twist, but the game isn't mechanically designed for this. You don't tank lots of damage, your gun jams, your sidearm is completely shit, enemies don't seem to miss, and are immune to radiation, and running while shooting makes your gun inaccurate. Well, even more so than it already is when you're standing completely still. By today's standards, Shadow of Chernobyl is outdated and a bit clunky, but for an indie game released in 2007, you have to admire the creativity and vision GSC had, and I'm glad they got to expand this universe out. I'm looking forward to seeing what direction the second game goes in. Hopefully they add more foods into the mix other than spicy sausage, monster, and bread. Makes it easier on the stalker's stomach, you know?